It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, either through my website, emailrevealer.com, or from at OppermanInvestigations@gmail.com. Is Jean Guerrero. She's a fascinating woman, and she's written a book about Hatemonger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the white nationalist agenda. You can find her at her website, JeanGuerrero.com. Jean, are you there?
Yes. Hi, Ed. How are you?
Thank you so much for coming on the show. Fascinating topic, Stephen Miller. But before we get to the book, tell us about yourself. Who is Jean Guerrero?
I'm an investigative journalist who's been covering Latin America since, for the past decade or so. And I've really been focusing on the immigration issue since the Obama administration, but very, very much so since day one of the Trump administration, reporting out of the busiest border crossing in the country, the border crossing between San Diego and Tijuana, and pretty much since day one of the Trump administration, reporting for PBS and NPR and other outlets about the impact of, the human consequences of the immigration agenda. And that, having reported on that kind of led me eventually to want to investigate Stephen Miller, the man who is behind these policies.
Yeah, can you believe that we would ever see a day where we would be putting little kids in concentration camp cages and that we would forget about it? A couple of days later, a new story would come along and it would just leave our minds. I don't know what's become of us as a nation. But do you give Obama a pass on all that? Obama, his immigration policies were horrific as well.
I don't give Obama a pass. I mean, I think that the Obama administration set the stage for what we're seeing now under the Trump administration. I mean, I think that Obama had different intentions. I mean, he had these record deportations. He was known as the deporter in chief, and he was doing it in part because he was hoping that he could appease, the Republican Party and lead to a compromise on immigration where he could protect the children of migrants, essentially children who were brought here at a very young age. But that turned out to be completely an unfounded hope of Obama's. That there was no compromise, and that's why he was forced to, issue the executive orders of DACA to try to protect dreamers and so on. But I mean, the fact that we saw these record deportations under the Obama administration, which I was covering, interviewing all these fathers who had been sent to Mexico without their children, with Obama, he had this emphasis on felons, not families, and that is something that completely deteriorated under the Trump administration, where Trump came in and said that we're going to be prioritizing anyone, no matter whether they've committed any crimes or not.
And I guess it's out of sight, out of mind. But I know you have your eye on the topic. Do we still have that backlog at the border with asylum seekers just being told to wait and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even a backlog anymore. Now it's just the U.S. is basically saying we're closed. We don't have room anymore, and because they're using the pandemic as an excuse to turn everybody away. So, Stephen Miller, who I write about in the book, had done a lot to dismantle the asylum system at the U.S.-Mexico border over the years. But with this pandemic, they were able to, utterly shut it down so that anyone who comes and asks for asylum, even if they have proof that they're being persecuted in their home country and they have a right to seek asylum in the United States under our federal law, the pandemic is being used as a sort of loophole to tell these people, sorry, you're out of luck.
Yeah, so many people, you'll see them on Facebook saying, well, they should just go through the legal process. But that's exactly what they're doing. They're presenting themselves to the U.S. Border Patrol and saying we need asylum.
Exactly.
It's a totally misrepresented story, and it's horrific. And then, too, again, when you think, because we saw the conditions before COVID-19 came along, the conditions in these detention centers where people were dying of the flu, you know? And I can only imagine what it's like now. Horrible.
Exactly. But part of it is just, you know, under the Obama administration, in the public imagination, immigration became, you know, the concept of immigration became married to the concept of criminality, because anytime that immigration was in the news, it was about, you know, felons. We're removing felons. We're taking them out. And, you know, this completely backfired on the Democratic Party, because it created in the public imagination this idea that, you know, all immigrants are criminals. And even if they come here seeking asylum, you know, with legitimate proof, that they're treated like criminals.
So I guess this is what inspired you to write Hatemonger about Stephen Miller, because he's the architect of Trump's immigration policies?
Exactly. You know, I was here, you know, reporting on the front lines, and I just kept hearing the White House, you know, then Secretary of Department of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen and Trump himself talking about how this policy of family separations was about law and order, that, you know, it was just about enforcing the law and about national security, and you know, that if you didn't want to be, you know, if you didn't want to be punished, then don't break the law. But I was on the ground, and I just kept interviewing so many parents who had done everything the legal way. You know, a father from El Salvador who came with his 1-year-old child and presented legally at a port of entry and had no criminal record, and was separated from his baby for 8 months, you know, locked up for 8 months while his baby was kept in a shelter that was later closed for a range of child abuses. And when the baby was returned, he was, you know, completely traumatized and filthy and, you know, covered in lice. And so all of these families who had done things legally and hadn't broken any laws and were being treated like criminals made me wonder, well, if this isn't about law and order, which it clearly is not about that, then what is it about? And so that's what led me to turn to Stephen Miller and trying to understand the man who was crafting these policies. Like, what is motivating this man? Like, what is it really about for him?
You know, it's amazing. You can explain that so articulately and so eloquently, and there's still going to be comments on the YouTube channel, people saying, well, they just should have came here legally. You know, there's a disassociation there. I guess all the pounding, the brainwashing that goes on. So who is Stephen Miller? What's the story? I know people know Stephen Miller, I think, because he went on the Sunday talk shows one day, and he had painted his head black to look like he had hair on his head. Do you have pictures of that in the book?
Yeah, there's a bit about that in the book. Actually, I can't remember. I can't. That's definitely something that came up a lot in my interviews, like with his friends who, you know, his friends were able to justify everything that he's done, including the cruelty to immigrants, but they were never able to justify or explain to themselves that decision to spray paint his head for this interview. But yeah, I mean, Stephen Miller he's the chief architect of Trump's immigration policy, as well as his top speechwriter. You know, from the very beginning, he's one of the earliest people to join the Trump campaign and the longest lasting advisor in the White House outside of the president's own family. You know, he outlasted his mentor, Steve Bannon, who was the chief strategist for a while. He outlasted his former boss, Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, who was the Attorney General. He's really outlasted everyone and had this incredible outsized impact. And, you know, from my reporting for the book, it became clear to me when I was investigating his childhood that Stephen Miller is a case study in radicalization. He was indoctrinated from a very young age. You know, he grew up in Santa Monica, California, this very progressive city, and, you know, began at a very early age to express, you know, very racist beliefs, you know, breaking up with a Mexican friend because of his Latino heritage, and going around his high school telling his Mexican classmates to go back to their countries and to speak English. And, when I was trying to understand this, I realized that Stephen Miller at this time is when he met a man named David Horowitz, who is a former Marxist turned right-wing radical who at the time was looking for people like Stephen Miller, young conservative men, teenagers, to teach them the tools of the civil rights movement in order to attack the civil rights movement. So, painting white men as victims of discrimination because of their white skin color, or calling people of color and their liberal allies racist and oppressive elites. So completely inverting and deflecting the language of the civil rights movement in order to attack minorities. And David Horowitz taught Stephen Miller how to do this. He introduced Stephen Miller when he was a teenager to the idea to the fantasy that he had to save the United States from, some kind of apocalypse in the form of too many brown and black people coming here. He taught him that everything we hold dear in America is a result of white men, and which is obviously ahistorical because it ignores the central role of people of color in this history. But, Stephen Miller at a very young age was taken with this. He was going through a hard time. His family had to move from a very affluent part of Santa Monica to a less affluent part because of, his father's business dealings, and he was tangled up in numerous legal disputes and bankruptcies related to his real estate company. And so Stephen Miller was feeling displaced. He was feeling lost. He was feeling angry. And here comes David Horowitz and offers him, a sense of purpose, a sense of he can do something to really matter and to change the world. And so, and then from private correspondence that I obtained for the book, you see David Horowitz playing a key role in shaping Stephen Miller's career, getting him his first jobs, and eventually, which I can talk to you about later, playing a direct role in shaping Trump's rhetoric and policies through Miller.
Fascinating. And at such a young age, what drew Horowitz to Miller?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Stephen Miller, he had called into this talk show host, the Larry Elder Show, which was broadcasting out of Los Angeles. Larry Elder is this black man who calls himself the sage from South Central, and he's very popular with white audiences because he says that systemic racism against black and brown people is a thing of the past, and that that people of color are more racist than white people, and that the problems of people of color are because of problems of self-determination in their communities and not because of actual systemic or institutional issues. So Stephen Miller calls into the show and he starts complaining about his high school and the multiculturalism and how they embrace diversity. And this is in part because he was already, Stephen Miller was listening to Rush Limbaugh. He was reading some conservative writers. But this is when, David Horowitz hears Stephen Miller and finds himself very impressed with Stephen Miller, like how he says that he was very articulate, he was very passionate, and so Stephen Miller actually reaches out to David Horowitz first. He was very good at networking from a very young age, and invites him to speak at his high school. And because David Horowitz had heard him on the radio, he agreed. And then you see David Horowitz start to invite Stephen Miller over to his house. And to let him publish promotional articles on his website, and to really from that point on become sort of like a father figure to Stephen Miller.
When I was talking to my dad today about, I was going to have you on as a guest, and we were talking about Stephen Miller. He mentioned to me, well, Stephen Miller is Jewish. How does he justify white nationalist philosophies when they're also anti-Jewish?
Exactly. I mean, it's David Horowitz is also Jewish, and this makes a lot of people scratch their heads. There is a growing, minority in the Jewish community that embraces these really far-right points of view that use the same terminology of the Nazis. This idea of the Nazis claiming that there's going to be some kind of white genocide, the way that there was, the genocide of the Jews, but completely, a figment of white supremacist imagination, but somehow they're able to get a growing movement within a minority of the Jewish American community to support it. And, you know, part of this is rooted in anti-Palestinian beliefs that some very hardcore Zionists have. It's definitely not what Zionism stands for overall. But David Horowitz, you know, because he is so pro-Israel and the way that his pro-Israel beliefs manifest is he completely denies Palestinians a right to a national identity. He claims, you know, he has said before, there is no Palestine, there are no Palestinians. And it's this very hardcore rejection of the brown and black communities that you then see replicating itself in the United States. Again, only with a minority of Jewish people like David Horowitz and Stephen Miller, but it is a reality, and it goes against the teachings, you know, of Stephen Miller's own family. I mean, they were Stephen Miller's grandmother spent her entire retirement recording the family history so that her grandchildren, you know, she writes that she's doing this for her grandchildren like Stephen Miller, so that they would never forget the value of people who come to this country with nothing but the clothes on their back and speaking no English, just as Stephen Miller's great-grandparents came to this country fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe as Jewish refugees. So it's, you know, it's incredible that these lessons that his ancestors handed down to him and tried to immortalize for him are lessons that he deliberately disregarded and has actually worked his entire life to undermine and to attack.
Yeah, it's fascinating you say that, because I remember growing up as a young man in New York, I would meet so many immigrants, you know, my friends, my parents and stuff, my parents of my friends. And I would always be so impressed. You left everything. You came here not speaking the language, not knowing anybody. What a brave thing to do, you know. And then you assimilated, learned the language, did all that stuff. And now it's just been turned on its head that it is somehow not to be respected.
Exactly.
Now, how did he get involved? Who introduced him to Michele Bachmann and Jeff Sessions? How did he get in with them? Horowitz?
So again, this is David Horowitz. Yeah, I mean, throughout Stephen Miller's time in high school and college at Duke University, he was seen as kind of a pariah. You know, like he offended people with his beliefs. You know, ranting about multiculturalism and claiming that racism was a figment of your imagination, but people kind of just rolled their eyes at him. They thought he was just too out there and too fringe to actually ever do anybody any harm. And he graduates, you know, without a job and kind of drifts in Europe for a little while and goes on his birthright trip to Israel. And then, you know, David Horowitz comes to the rescue, you know, once more and finds Stephen Miller a job with Tea Party Congresswoman Michele Bachmann, who is somebody that David Horowitz had met through these conservative forums that he's hosted, you know, for years, like these West Coast retreats and, you know, restoration weekends that he hosts for conservative leaders. And he felt that Michele Bachmann shared his beliefs about Muslims. You know, Stephen Miller was leading for a little while in college this project called the Terrorism Awareness Project that essentially just conflates Muslims and Palestinians with terrorists. And, you know, says that the goal of jihad for every Muslim is the destruction of Western civilization, which is obviously not what jihad means to a great majority of Muslims. That's only what it means to extremists. But anyway, so Michele Bachmann, David Horowitz believed that she shared their beliefs about Muslims, and so he hooked Stephen Miller up with Bachmann and got him a job as press secretary. And that's how Stephen Miller starts to rise within government.
Now, you mentioned Duke. Oh, he was involved with that scandal with the Duke lacrosse team, too, and speaking out about that?
Yeah, he was repeatedly drawn to racial controversies. You know, there was a black woman who accused several Duke lacrosse players of raping her. And, you know, while the investigation was ongoing, Stephen Miller repeatedly came out in public, you know, including on national television, defending the white players and you know, saying that they were being discriminated against because of their white skin color. And, Ultimately the charges against these men were dropped, and Stephen Miller saw this as evidence that he had been right all along. So he starts to double down and triple down on his hardcore ideology and view himself as some kind of prophet. And this is how you see him, operating within Michele Bachmann's office, and eventually, David Horowitz gets him a job with Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, kind of the leading nativist on Capitol Hill.
Then how does he catches Trump's eye?
Right. So with Trump, Stephen Miller had his eye on Trump for a while. He read an interview that Trump gave to Breitbart talking about how the United States was turning into the, quote, third world. Which is a very popular saying, especially, among white supremacists, to talk about, the browning of America and how that's turning it into the third world. And so Stephen Miller got really excited about Trump, and he emailed the interview to some friends and said, I really hope this guy runs for president. And when he did announce his candidacy, Stephen Miller was very excited, and he starts to contribute free labor to the Trump campaign, shaping his, sending memos to the Trump campaign about talking points and, immigration policy, and eventually gets hired, in January of 2016.
Do you know if he had any influence on that speech at the Trump Tower with the escalator when he starts talking about Mexicans or rapists and all that stuff?
No, he didn't. That's one of the few speeches that came before Stephen Miller was officially working for the campaign, because Donald Trump and Stephen Miller, one of the ways that they're able to have so much influence and power together and mutually benefit each other is that Donald Trump has had and expressed an emotional racism for many decades. And Stephen Miller, what he brings to the table is this incredible work ethic and discipline and, a strategic white nationalist agenda that he, is able to use to systematically harm communities of color in a way that Trump's emotional racism on its own might not do the same.
And I guess his first big move was the ban on Muslims.
Yeah, and that speaks to the influence of David Horowitz. Like, one of the very first executive orders that we saw out of the White House was the Muslim ban, targeting people from majority Muslim countries, and, was struck down by the courts and had to be rewritten multiple times before it was actually allowed to stay in place. And this, this is David Horowitz, whispering in Stephen Miller's ear from the time that he was a young man that Muslims pose some kind of existential threat to America. That's one of the first things that we see. But then, for a majority of Stephen Miller's time in the White House, he really becomes obsessed with the immigration system and implementing a white nationalist agenda. And I call it white nationalist because he was pulling his immigration policies directly from think tanks that were created, by white supremacists who believe in population control for non-white people, and who created these think tanks to launder white supremacist ideas through the language of heritage and the language of economics and the language of national security, in order to make these white supremacist ideas palatable to the mainstream and to be something that, appeals to people who don't consider themselves to be racist. And one of the first things that Stephen Miller does after the Muslim ban is he targets refugee admissions, which, most refugees who come through the refugee admissions process come from Muslim majority countries. So again, it's his anti-Muslim beliefs expressing themselves, and he succeeds in slashing refugee admissions to new historic lows every year, which is something that's going to have decades of consequences, because dismantling and destroying this infrastructure is easy, but rebuilding it is going to take a very long time, because these are entire offices across the world that were closed, people laid off who normally process these refugees. So that's one way that he had a huge impact. And then also just completely obliterating the asylum system at the U.S.-Mexico border through some of his initial executive orders, and then, through the systematic separation of children from their parents, which was used as sort of the performance of cruelty to deter people from coming here at all.
I wanted to ask you, back to the Muslim ban for a second. So he's the brain, it's his brainchild. He comes up with the plan. But then when it was put into action, there was no plan. There was no mechanism on how anything was going to be done. The airports didn't know what to do. Customs didn't know what to do. Behind the scenes, Did you look into that and figure out what the hell went on with that?
Well, that's the issue with that is that Stephen Miller has always, done things without consulting other, he consults his core group of allies, but he completely disregards the bureaucracy and the normal, the standard operating procedure. So there were, the heads of various agencies within the Department of Homeland Security that are tasked with implementing this order who didn't, even see it until the day they were supposed to be implementing it. And so there was a lot of confusion about, does this apply to green card holders? Does this apply to people whose airplanes are in midair right now?
Right.
And, there was just a lot of confusion, and this is in part because the man who was put in charge of these policies, the man who was put in charge of policies for the Trump administration is a man who has no prior policy-making experience. He is a public relations flag, who at the age of 31 was given unprecedented power over the immigration system. And this, has broad Homeland Security implications regardless of whether you care about the immigration issue or not, because from day one in the White House, Stephen Miller was narrowing the focus of the Department of Homeland Security, which has a very broad mandate, protecting the American people from everything from, public health crises like the pandemic that we're seeing today, to cyber warfare, to, domestic terrorism, which is principally, these days from white terrorists, into something that was he turned it into something that was hyper focused on keeping brown and black people out of this country, to systematically re-engineer the demographics and the ethnic flows into this country, and not something that was actually focused on broader national security goals. And White House officials that I spoke to for the book tell me that this left Americans more vulnerable to a range of real threats, and it partly explains the disastrous response to the pandemic that we're seeing today, because most of the top positions at the Department of Homeland Security right now are either vacant or they are held by people in acting capacity, essentially puppets for Miller to manipulate and ram through his agenda. And this is on purpose, because Stephen Miller from day one was trying to find ways around, the national security experts and around the bureaucracy so that he would be the guy in charge.
I had a million questions for you. Now, Jean, right before we left for the commercial break, you were talking about how they're closing down these points for refugees seeking asylum. Now, just imagine, you're a cartel is trying to kill you and your family, or these right-wing death squads are taking down your city where you live, and now you got nowhere to go. That's a incredibly heartless, inhumane policy. Then you have this incarceration of little kids in cages in deplorable conditions, and like you said briefly about them getting molested and abused in these conditions. Now, the situation where many of these kids are not being tracked. We don't know where they went, and they can't be reunited with their families. Is that still going on?
Yes, I mean the Health and Human Services Department has done a lot to try to correct this situation and to keep track of the children and to communicate better with the Department of Homeland Security when there are separations. But, there's this idea that the separations stopped when a federal judge in San Diego in 2018 ordered that the government stop this inhumane practice of systematically separating families. but it never actually stopped. I mean, the zero tolerance policy was revoked, but you have to go back to the initial executive orders that Stephen Miller helped to write to understand, that these separations are still ongoing because of the fact that Border Patrol and ICE officers were given unprecedented power to keep people detained, even if they have a legitimate asylum claim, and giving them greater capacity to deport people. So you see parents getting deported without their children. You see children still being separated from their families. And it's a problem that's kind of happening underneath the radar because it's tied to these complicated executive orders that don't straight up call for family separations, but lay the groundwork that make family separations possible.
And many times they have family here in the United States that we could send these kids to go live with while they're waiting for their hair. It's just heartless and just incredible. But now, when you see these kinds of these things are falling apart all the time, like with the Muslim ban, it's all chaos afterwards, right? How does he survive then? Because don't people how has he survived in the White House this long, where everybody gets fired?
Well, yeah, you would think that there would be some kind of consequence for the fact that many of the things that Stephen Miller has done have been struck down by the courts. But in Trump's eyes, the goal it has already been accomplished by the time that the media starts to attack him as racist or as inhumane. And this is part of why, Stephen Miller has been able to stick around so long in the White House is that Trump understands that Stephen Miller appeals to his most hardcore base. And Trump believes that this appeal is what got him into the White House in the first place. He thinks that the demonizing rhetoric that Stephen Miller is so skilled at inserting into his speeches, with very vivid descriptions of crimes committed by migrants, talking about migrants butchering little girls or taking hammers to crush a woman's eye sockets, just really gruesome stuff. He believes that rhetoric and the very anti-immigrant policies from Stephen Miller helped him win in the first place. And so for him, it's not so much. I mean, Trump. Trump is a racist. He's expressed racist beliefs throughout his life, but he's not a fanatic. He's not an ideologue. He's not an extremist the way that Stephen Miller is. So Stephen Miller does have the goal of re-engineering the ethnic flows into this country, but for Trump, it's all about winning and winning re-election in 2020. And so he believes that so long as, he's exciting the base with these systematically cruel policies, even if they get stopped in the courts, that just gives them another excuse to demonize people, because then they can, demonize what Stephen Miller calls the left-wing activist judges, in the judiciary, and they get to demonize the Democratic Party. They get to demonize everyone as trying to destroy America's heritage, which is really a dog whistle for white supremacists. This idea of white genocide and this idea that brown and black people pose some kind of existential threat. But even though these things sometimes are stopped in the courts or revoked, they have their intended effect of riling people up.
What about the statement recently about Trump saying about the suburbs and the women in the suburbs that don't like low-income housing and intruding on their... can you trace that back to Miller?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Stephen Miller, he's obsessed with the immigration issue, so he's not so much in public housing policy plans, but the rhetoric that Trump is using to create fears around, to rally suburban housewives around him, and this idea that brown and black people are going to come into their neighborhoods and ruin them. That's something that Trump has believed for a very long time and expressed beliefs like this for a very long time. But Stephen Miller, shapes his rhetoric in a way that is very effective. He uses terms like far left fascism, an unhinged left wing mob, and pulls from white supremacist books like The Camp of the Saints, this super white supremacist book that characterizes the allies of people of color as agitators and anarchists and mobs that want to destroy America, that want to destroy civilization, which is the same language that you see Trump using today. So what Stephen Miller does is he takes these things that Trump already believes in these very racist sentiments, and he applies white supremacist architecture and really extremely demonizing language that is effective at inciting fear and hatred towards brown and black people.
What are some of the most outrageous things you want us to know about Stephen Miller?
Well, I mean, for one, Stephen Miller promoted this book that I just mentioned, The Camp of the Saints, in 2015 through Breitbart. And for me, that was a real turning point when I was, I'd been immersing myself in the white supremacist and white nationalist literature that has inspired Stephen Miller for many years. And it was, chilling, but reading that book helped me understand and open my eyes just to how dangerous of a figure Stephen Miller actually is. This is a book that, it's about the destruction of the white world by brown refugees who are described in completely dehumanizing and demonizing language as monsters and beasts and teeming ants toiling for the white man's comfort, and centipedes and bathing and just horrible stuff, and it explicitly endorses violence and hatred towards non-white people as a survival mechanism against this conspiracy theory of white genocide. And this is a book that Trump's most powerful advisor was inspired by and promoted in 2015. So when you see Trump saying things like, talking about how Border Patrol should shoot migrants in the legs, or saying things like that Black Lives Matter protesters, like when the looting starts, the shooting starts, this is language straight out of this book. And you can see why a candidate like Donald Trump, together with someone who's very strategic, like Stephen Miller, present a real threat to communities of color. And you see it expanding over time. I mean, initially they were very much focused on Mexicans and Muslims, and then it came to include Central Americans, and now it's encompassing Black Lives Matter protesters, and now it's encompassing their anti-racist white allies. And it just continues to grow, but continues to fit into this white supremacist framework that people of color and their allies pose an existential threat to the existing order.
And then in reality, a couple of the biggest raids that they've pulled off were 7-Eleven workers and those meatpacking plant workers. What a threat they are. You risk your life going in to get your coffee at 7-Eleven every day. Make it out of their life.
His own parents, they employ, Stephen Miller's family for a very long time, they've relied on housekeepers from Latin America who in some cases came here illegally. And I mean, they understand that these are people who contribute to society. And, for some reason, Stephen Miller has decided that he's going to dedicate his life to demonizing and damaging their lives.
Yeah, people are somehow able to separate that your neighbor that you see every day and wave hello, goodbye, it is the same one that's telling you it's a danger, the one you go to for help when you got to jump your car, Now, you talk to a lot of Miller's friends, okay? You said before that they make excuses for him. What are you talking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of his close friends told me that he doesn't believe that Stephen Miller is as bad as he's being painted in the media, and that everyone is racist, and Stephen Miller is just kind of speaking to that racism that lives in everybody, and just the kind of stuff that you would expect to hear from a friend of Stephen Miller's. Although this friend also told me that when he was when he watches Stephen Miller on TV, he occasionally becomes very concerned for his friend because of the fact that he comes off as so villainous. And he has, he has told me that over time, Stephen Miller has become more and more consumed by his mission to the point where he's become kind of unrecognizable even to his own friends.
And with all the politics within the White House, Bannon getting kicked out, how does he get along with Jared and Ivanka? Because it seems like whenever there's or even Trump too, if someone gets too popular, like right away he'll get rid of them too.
Yeah, Stephen Miller's really good at navigating and managing the relationships within the White House. He knows that he needs to have a positive relationship with Kushner and Ivanka, and he has had positive relationships with them from the very beginning. And the other thing about Stephen is that he's comfortable in Trump's shadow, unlike people like Steve Bannon, who are obsessed with media attention and are very skilled at self-mythologizing through the press and, kind of exaggerating their role. Stephen Miller is content to, linger in the shadows, and he never gets out ahead of Trump, or at least tries not to, and is very careful to always cast himself as a mere devoted vehicle of Trump's agenda, which speaks to Trump's ego and, ensures that Trump will never feel some kind of jealousy about Stephen Miller, trying to overpower him or something, because Stephen Miller is always, White House officials who I spoke to for this book tell me they were always afraid to question or challenge Stephen Miller because Stephen Miller was always invoking the president's name and the president's demands and the president's desires. So it was like to challenge Miller was like to challenge Donald Trump. And so people, they were very careful about doing that.
So Miller and Trump meet privately often?
Yeah, Stephen Miller has direct access to the president, and he often makes sure that he's the last person to speak to Trump, and that's one of the ways that he's, had an outsized influence, is that Donald Trump tends to regurgitate the beliefs of the last person who spoke to him, and Stephen Miller makes sure that he is that person as often as possible.
Okay, we've been talking about the book Hatemonger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda with Jean Guerrero. You can find her at jeanguerrero.com. Jean, because I want to ask you about that article you wrote about your dad, too. But before we get to that, what do you want to leave us with Hatemonger?
I would leave people with this idea that, regardless of whether you care about immigration or what happens to immigrants, Stephen Miller is having an impact on your life because he has been given the reins of essentially the entire Department of Homeland Security, and he is an extremist and an ideologue who was radicalized at a very young age, and that is something that needs to be taken into consideration and has broad Homeland Security implications regardless of your feelings about immigration. And the other thing that I would add about what I learned is that what is happening now nationally is sort of like history repeating itself for what was happening in California in the 90s when Stephen Miller was growing up. The California of the 90s when Stephen Miller was growing up is sort of like a microcosm for what we're seeing nationally now. There was a lot of hostility towards immigrants, unprecedented attacks on, bilingual education, on social services for the children of undocumented migrants, and talk of an invasion and the browning of the state. And this was because white people became a minority for the first time in California that decade. And there was a lot of white fear and white resentment about what that would mean. And this idea that there would be some kind of apocalypse, which obviously never happened. And for me, as a journalist, I draw optimism from that because nationally we're heading into 2050 where white people are going to become a minority nationwide for the first time. And so I think we're just seeing the same growing pains that we saw in California, but ultimately we're going to become a more diverse nation that celebrates multiculturalism and understands the strength that it brings to the table in much the same way that happened in California.
And I'd say I have some friends that would tell you that the whites were a minority in California about 500 years ago. When they showed up, and they'll make that a serious point about that. But now, real quick, about your dad. You wrote this incredible article, and I really love the way you approached the topic and it's called "My Dad is a Targeted Individual."
Yeah.
I'd love to have you back and talk about that sometime. Could you just give us a?
To.
Yeah, that's really. Can you describe the article real quick in like a minute?
Yeah, I mean, my dad, he believes that the CIA has been targeting him throughout his life with, mind control weapons, beaming voices into his head and electric shocks into his body to try to manipulate and control his behavior. And as a young woman, I became very interested in trying to. I felt an obligation as a journalist and as his daughter to investigate the possibility that what he was saying was true. So, I filed all these Freedom of Information Act requests and et cetera, and really followed my father into his rabbit hole. And ultimately, what I concluded is that regardless of what my father believes, he can sort of be seen as like, a prophet almost of the actual mind control and behavior manipulation that we're all exposed to through our digital devices on a daily basis. Advertisers through targeted manipulation, like, manipulating our political beliefs, our perception of the world, through alternative facts. And this is, a growing problem in our society that people like my father can be seen as sort of canaries in the coal mine, alerting us to the real threat that these devices pose to our lives and our agency and our free will.
A beautiful article. And what's the name of the article again?
My father is a targeted individual. My father says he's a targeted individual. Maybe we all are.
And it's in Wired magazine. Hatemonger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. JeanGuerrero.com. If you're up tomorrow morning, Saturday morning, check out the MSNBC. What time are you going to be on?
I'm going to be on at 3 p.m. Pacific, so 6 p.m. Eastern.
There you go. Thank you so much, Jean. I really enjoyed this.